The patrons were relaxing in the bar. The baristas were crafting cocktails for the visitors and enhancing their leisure time. One of the customers showed interest in SeoWon, but he attempted to avoid contact. The customer was persistent and openly declared his intentions. He even knelt before the worker and leaned close to the bartender's face. The man noted that the visitor released pheromones, making it increasingly difficult for him to restrain himself. Summoning his willpower, SeoWon touched the guest's shoulders and seated him beside him. The bartender apologized and remarked that if anything happened, he could be fired. He himself recalled his debts. Losing his job could pose a serious problem. The customer frowned but accepted the argument. Then the barista began preparing a drink, and the guest smirked. He placed his hand on SeoWon's chin, leaned against him, and then laid money on the table, ignoring the bartender's attempt to pull away. The protagonist had no choice but to comply with the other's desires. SeoWon was returning home. He pondered how exhausted he was. As he closed the door, he thought of sleep, but he soon had to rise for his classes. The man undressed and went to shower. Then he opened the wardrobe and began selecting his clothes. Looking at himself in the mirror, he put on his glasses, then assessed his appearance, and headed out. The protagonist walked towards the educational institution. Thoughts of sleep tempted him to skip, but he was distracted by the admiring comments of those around him. A student arrived in an expensive car for classes. People whispered and spread rumors about HeeYeon. They talked about his wealth and how he had rejected the department's most beautiful woman. SeoWon ignored their words and proceeded to the classroom. But near the door, he encountered the subject of their gossip. HeeYeon smiled warmly at the protagonist, but he ignored him and walked on. Not receiving a response, HeeYeon was disheartened. The student watched his classmates back and wondered how to win his favor. But then an acquaintance approached him, who remarked on HeeYeon's attention to his classmate, and received the reply that his greeting had gone unanswered. The young man immediately began to protest, but the brunette was not so adamant. However, his friend persisted in his stance. Then the young man entered the classroom and encountered the girl's greetings. The protagonist took notice of the scene, but then returned to his book. It was already dark outside. SeoWon was at the bar complaining about being called to work on his day off. The boss explained that the bartender had gone into heat, and thus he had to call someone in to cover. But they were interrupted as the door opened, and patrons entered the establishment. The men greeted them politely, but as soon as the protagonist looked up, he was very surprised, as he had not expected to see his classmate there. SeoWon looked fearfully at his classmate HeeYeon, unable to comprehend why he had come to this bar. The brunette interacted with his companions without showing much enthusiasm, responding calmly and without expressing emotions. But then the alpha noticed the worker awkwardly fidgeting near the bar, whose appearance seemed vaguely familiar. When the protagonist noticed HeeYeon's attentive gaze, he immediately turned away, not expecting him to approach. The man asked if the bartender was studying at Moensong University in the management department. SeoWon tried to pretend he didn't understand what was being said and claimed he had never been there. But the boss intervened at the wrong moment, addressing his subordinate by name and questioning his deceit, as he had received a scholarship from that university. Then HeeYeon was convinced of his assumption and remarked that he had never expected to see his classmate in such a place. Shortly thereafter, the bartender was sitting at a table with the brunette, holding a glass of strong liquor and thinking about his misfortune. The protagonist was distracted by a question about his reasons for working there, but he had no desire to answer. So SeoWon curtly remarked that he didn't owe any explanations, and it would be better if the man laughed it off and left, forgetting he had seen him there. Nevertheless, HeeYeon displayed an unusual curiosity towards the brunette and continued to inquire. Then the protagonist stood up and declared that if such persistent questioning continued, he would simply join the other patrons. However, as soon as the man moved a bit away, the alpha smiled and stated that if he was left alone, he would go to the management and report a transgression, which would undoubtedly lead to punishment. The ultimatum incited rage. The man couldn't understand if his interlocutor truly enjoyed witnessing people's dismissal. HeeYeon then patted the couch invitingly. All that was needed to avoid a reprimand was to sit beside him. SeoWon had no choice but to suppress his desire to leave and return to his seat under the alpha's satisfied gaze. As soon as the protagonist sat down on the couch, the brunette took his hand, and when he protested such behavior, he was told it was merely to prevent the bartender from running away again. To his assurances that he had no intention of leaving, HeeYeon, with a satisfied smile, replied that he didn't believe him and therefore wouldn't let go. Even the remark that SeoWon was at work and couldn't abandon a patron didn't work. However, The customer only mentioned the existence of one rule in that establishment. A guest could spend the night with one of the staff, and SeoWon Han confirmed the service, but also stated that he didn't want any trouble and therefore didn't seclude himself with patrons. To HeeYeon's question regarding his candidacy, the bartender confidently withdrew his hand and firmly rejected the offer. However, the brunette had no intention of giving up and thus offered to pay a large sum, greatly surprising the man. SeoWon Han expressed disbelief, and so when the customer asked for his account number to make an immediate deposit, he simply dictated the necessary digits. Soon he saw a message about a deposit of 1 billion won, leaving the protagonist with no choice but to follow HeeYeon to a hotel room. Once they were in the room and the guest described his requests, SeoWon Han was outraged, as he was not an Omega and considered such a pastime with an Alpha unacceptable. He would have preferred to return the entire sum and leave, but the brunette declared he wouldn't allow the money to be returned. HeeYeon loomed over the protagonist, asking him to calm down and grant him what he desired. SeoWon Han's mind was racing with thoughts about the situation. He couldn't believe the brunette genuinely wanted to dominate him. The man tried to stand up and expressed his opinion that it wouldn't work, and he couldn't fulfill such a request, as he found it shameful, especially given their acquaintance. HeeYeon saw nothing wrong with it and assured him he had no plans to tell anyone about it. However, the protagonist still hoped to avoid providing the service and return the money. Then his classmate smirked and said he would agree to that only if SeoWon Han returned 4 times the amount. The brunette was outraged by such a proposal, considering it dishonorable blackmail. But the visitor noted that he only had money to achieve his desire. His thoughts were that only in this way could he somehow get closer to the protagonist. He then approached and embraced the bartender, and as SeoWon Han looked at his partner's face, he realized why the man was considered the most handsome in the department. HeeYeon noticed the bartender's wide eyes and asked him not to be distracted, as otherwise he faced a debt of 4 billion won. The protagonist asked the client to be quick, even if it was rough, but he insisted on making it enjoyable, smiling at every reaction his actions elicited. When the brunette was about to proceed to the next stage, he unexpectedly heard the man's soft snores before him. He couldn't believe that SeoWon Han had fallen asleep at such a moment, but decided not to wake him and leave everything for next time. Then HeeYeon adjusted the clothes on his classmate and sat next to him on the bed, gazing at his face. It was only at dawn that SeoWon Han woke up in the hotel room, and it took him a moment to remember where he was. Only a bit later, the events of the previous day began to resurface in his mind, and he felt a certain embarrassment at having fallen asleep at such a moment. Then he noticed a piece of paper folded in quarters on the nightstand and picked it up, reading the note left by HeeYeon. The bartender was categorically displeased with the note, as he had no intention of dealing with the brunette again, let alone agreeing to a next time. When SeoWon Han arrived at the university and saw his classmate, thoughts began to surface about what he had avoided by accidentally falling asleep, and he headed to his seat. For HeeYeon, the protagonist's arrival did not go unnoticed either, and he began to contemplate how it was hard to imagine that this scholarship recipient and yesterday's bartender were the same person. He didn't realize he had spoken the last phrase aloud until his conversation partner noticed and concluded that she wasn't being listened to, even though the brunette tried to convince her otherwise. It was already dark outside, and SeoWon Han was in his boss's office, complaining about being called in again on his rightful day off. The young man was about to head home, ignoring the overtime, but his boss grabbed his hand, asking him to stay. Nevertheless, the protagonist made his way to the exit, but unexpectedly encountered his classmate in the corridor, whom he wanted to avoid at all costs. HeeYeon began questioning why the brunette hadn't changed into his uniform and said it was too early to leave work. Then SeoWon Han roughly pulled his hand from the grasp and informed him that he was going home on his rightful day off, and the brunette could find another toy. But the man said he wasn't going to look for others, as he needed the protagonist's company right now. The bartender was confused by such words, feeling that for this wealthy man, such relationships meant nothing, and others would be quite surprised by this revelation. HeeYeon thwarted all attempts to avoid him, expressing his desire for the brunette to bring him pleasure. In search of excuses, the protagonist was ready to return to work, stating that he had several tables reserved. Nonetheless, the man was persistent and reminded him of the paid money, and when SeoWon Han tried to refuse, he squeezed his forearm even tighter. Then SeoWon Han, pulling his hand away, agreed, and a delighted HeeYeon invited him to follow. HeeYeon led the protagonist to a hotel room and embraced his partner, but the bartender was embarrassed and tried to act more distant. He sat on the bed and expressed his desire to get it over with as quickly as possible, but the brunette said he wasn't in a hurry. The man said he didn't want to hurt his partner, mentally adding that this was especially true for SeoWon Han. To the protagonist, such thinking was somewhat incomprehensible, but HeeYeon just caught his hands and smirked. Since the brunette was a dominant alpha, it was difficult for the bartender to resist. He had no choice but to submit. Then the man loosened his tie and remarked that even if SeoWon Han decided to fall asleep again, he wouldn't back down this time and would wake his partner. HeeYeon memorized every expression on his face, hearing words that contradicted his body's reactions. The protagonist thought he would never say what his classmate wanted to hear, but the brunette was determined to get what he desired and wasn't going to give up. HeeYeon thoroughly exhausted the protagonist, and afterward, the bartender lay there pondering what had happened. He looked at the alpha lying beside him and thought about how he could sleep so peacefully after what had transpired. SeoWon Han picked up his things, planning to gather them quickly and leave the hotel room. Upon arriving home, he saw a new notification on his phone and noticed a large monetary transfer from his involuntary partner. In a rage, he called HeeYeon, who said he had sent the money as an apology. The protagonist then reminded him that they had agreed on just one night, receiving a rather calm response that the brunette wasn't seeking further encounters. But the very next day, during his shift, when SeoWon Han was entertaining another client, HeeYeon entered the bar. The protagonist was curious as to why the man had returned to the bar if he had promised not to come again. Then, HeeYeon awkwardly touched his neck and with a smile replied that in the morning, when he didn't see the bartender beside him, he felt so lonely that he couldn't help but come back. The brunette expressed his desire for SeoWon Han to take care of him at that moment, forcing the bartender to inform his client that he would need to step away for a while. After that, the bartender led his classmate out through the back door and began to protest, as everything should have ended that night. But HeeYeon, with a self-satisfied smile, said he had come only because the protagonist had left without saying goodbye. He also mentioned that he wanted SeoWon Han to accompany him to the university, but the bartender said he'd rather skip than go there in such company. Having stated his opinion, the barista informed that he was returning to his customer and suggested the brunette leave. HeeYeon sighed deeply, thinking that things turned out to be not as simple as he had imagined. Upon returning to the hall, SeoWon Han apologized to his guest for having to step away due to a strange visitor. The client expressed understanding, noted the protagonist's popularity, and was ready to continue enjoying his company when they were interrupted again. HeeYeon sat directly at the table and asked why the bartender did not provide similar services to him. Then, unexpectedly, he grabbed SeoWon Han by the tie, pulling him closer until the man pushed the brunette away. The protagonist protested and asked him to stop distracting him from his work, but his classmate ignored him and continued doing as he pleased. The bartender noticed that HeeYeon had begun releasing pheromones, frightening the other patrons, especially the Omega client nearby. The brunette even addressed the client, expressing his desire to take away his server, calmly remarking that surely he didn't want to continue sitting in his company. SeoWon Han once again asked the alpha to leave and questioned if he was willing to take responsibility should anything happen to the other patron. However, HeeYeon didn't see anything to be accountable for, presenting the situation as if he had politely asked the client. The protagonist stated that such behavior and the release of pheromones were unacceptable and suggested the man should not return to this establishment. In response, the brunette pointed out that the bartender should not speak to a customer in such a manner, warning that his rude behavior could result in punishment from the management. At that moment, the boss unexpectedly appeared and asked SeoWon Han to take this patron and leave, as panic was starting to spread in the hall. Looking around and seeing the reactions of others, the protagonist asked HeeYeon to follow him. In the corridor, the protagonist remarked that if his classmate continued behaving this way, the bar would lose its patrons. The brunette then set a condition, demanding another night together, supposedly because the bartender had left without saying goodbye. HeeYeon once again led the protagonist to a hotel room, now savoring the sensations his partner was giving him. However, the brunette's thoughts kept returning to how he never expected to be able to touch this man in such a way. He recalled how back in university, a classmate assigned to a project with him and SeoWon Han had asked him to take on his part of the work because he was busy. HeeYeon had complied and agreed to do the task, but despite the guy's gratitude, the brunette was tired of such behavior from people. In the next moment, the quiet scholarship student approached and handed over his part of the work, muttering about the simplicity of the assignment before leaving. No matter how much HeeYeon had reached out at that moment, SeoWon Han completely ignored him and walked away, unaware of the impression he had left on the department's most handsome man. After that, HeeYeon invited the brunette to have a drink as a thank you for the work, but he refused and angrily stared at any attempt to start a conversation. Even when he tried to observe from afar, contemplating possible topics for conversation, it did not go unnoticed. Now, SeoWon noticed that his partner was distracted by unrelated thoughts and immediately voiced his opinion. The brunette began apologizing for allowing himself to be distracted and asked to continue, but the bartender found it amusing. He already considered his actions shameful, and realizing that HeeYeon had been thinking about something else made him feel even worse. The man was not inclined to continue, especially given the situation HeeYeon had put him in, and intended to leave, even if it meant abandoning the act halfway. No matter how much the brunette tried to stop him, the protagonist was not willing to agree after his efforts had been trampled. He only stated that this time the alpha had ruined everything and warned him not to think about using pheromones and causing panic in the bar again before leaving. HeeYeon acknowledged the validity of the words and cursed himself for failing such an opportunity to get closer, needing to think of a new plan. The next day, when the protagonist arrived at the university, he immediately encountered HeeYeon's gaze as he stood in a group of chatting girls. The man began to recall how his classmates' behavior could differ so much when in public versus alone with him. SeoWon couldn't come to terms with the fact that it was indeed the same person. He even wanted to open the eyes of those around him to the true nature of the department's most handsome man, but understood it could cause problems for himself. The brunette, in turn, thought about the previous night, wondering if he should have used force when the bartender decided to leave, as he wouldn't be so upset now. Then HeeYeon received a notification on his smartphone and pulled the device from his pocket, looking at the screen with a pleased expression. Meanwhile, the protagonist received a message from his boss, asking him to come to work early as an important client was expected. As the bartender headed for the exit, he didn't notice his classmate's cunning smirk while holding his phone. Only at the bar did SeoWon learn that the boss had signed a lucrative contract that concerned him directly. The protagonist was outraged by the situation, expressing that making such a decision without his involvement was unacceptable. The boss admitted his mistake and explained that the amount offered by the client was so substantial that he agreed without hesitation. Hearing the stated sum, SeoWon was on the verge of shock, thinking the client must be crazy to pay so much to monopolize the services of a specific employee. When the protagonist heard that the guest was an alpha like himself, he had an unsettling suspicion about HeeYeon. But he quickly dismissed these thoughts, as no matter how wealthy the brunette was, he doubted he would spend so much money on such a whim. The boss was very concerned about adhering to the contract, even offering a promotion if the client was satisfied. Afterward, the boss led the bartender to the hotel room, where the visitor was waiting and instructed him to take good care of him. Before entering, the protagonist could only think that the guest must have a problem if he wanted to dominate an alpha. Even if SeoWon had any thoughts about the brunette, he couldn't contain his surprise when he saw him in the room. In disbelief that HeeYeon was the client with the absurd request, the bartender even asked his classmate what he was doing there. The man couldn't understand such extravagance and pitied the brunette's parents, but he simply noted that he had earned the entire sum himself on the stock market. The disparity in their circumstances irritated the protagonist, causing him to grit his teeth in an attempt to hold back his emotions. HeeYeon observed the bartender's behavior and decided to inquire about his state of mind, to which he received a candid response about solving problems through money. The man reacted quite calmly to this remark and mentioned that the bar owner had divulged information about his subordinate's debts, which explained his actions. SeoWon, upon learning these details, could only mentally curse his boss for revealing too much. Meanwhile, the brunette stated that he would handle the debts if the bartender provided him with services. The protagonist couldn't fathom what HeeYeon was after, as he seemed to gain nothing in return, raising suspicions of a treacherous betrayal. The brunette clearly saw the bartender's distrust and contemplated how to rectify it, thus proposing to give a portion of the money up front and the rest later. SeoWon thought about his need for money due to debts, but feared being deceived if he trusted the words. However, refusing such a client could be dangerous, as he might complain to the management about poor service. Sighing, the protagonist wished his boss had not agreed to the contract for providing services. Just then, he received a message from his boss, reminding him to take care of the client and threatening that any dereliction of duty would result in unpaid shifts. The bartender couldn't help but suspect HeeYeon of blackmail, but the latter noted that it was the bar owner who had called him first, likely to secure such a client. When the brunette decided to hasten his classmate's response, SeoWon stated he would agree, but under several conditions. First, He didn't want any talk about receiving a large sum at the end of their arrangement, preferring to get an advance payment. The second condition was that the guest should not touch him until he had paid for the services. When the bartender saw HeeYeon's pensive expression, he assumed something was amiss. The man confirmed that the issue was the advance payment, as he wanted intimacy with the brunette right away and was about to embrace him when SeoWon stepped back. The protagonist also sought an explanation for this choice, and upon hearing about the attraction, he couldn't understand how someone like HeeYeon could consider it normal to be interested in another alpha. The bartender couldn't fathom the visitor's confidence about them being together, even without being a true pair. He thought that either of them could meet their true mate, raising the question of what would happen in such a case. When he voiced this concern, the brunette involuntarily clenched his fists. He didn't even want to think about the protagonist having a true mate. Losing control of his actions, HeeYeon gripped the bartender's shoulders painfully and said it would be much better if SeoWon's body bore his name. He didn't know if an alpha's body could bear another alpha's name, but he was willing to pray for it. Having voiced his hopes, the brunette pulled the protagonist closer, while he pondered how far his classmate was willing to go to achieve his goals. At home, when SeoWon looked in the mirror, he saw a spread of red marks on his shoulders and neck, cursing the troublesome client. The protagonist wondered how he would now go to the university, as he had no lightweight turtlenecks in his wardrobe. When the students saw the brunette in a warm sweater despite the hot weather, they were puzzled. Someone even suggested that the scholarship student couldn't afford new clothes, causing laughter among the onlookers. The bartender continued reading his book, doing his best to ignore his classmates' reactions. Soon, HeeYeon arrived, and upon hearing his voice, the protagonist unconsciously clenched his fists. He wanted to strangle the wealthy man for making him endure the heat. However, the brunette, noticing the protagonist's reaction, merely smiled, finding his attempt to hide his neck amusing. It was evening, and SeoWon was at work, sitting in front of his classmate who had bought his time. He constantly fiddled with the collar of his shirt, which failed to conceal the consequences of the previous day. Then the guest handed him a black bag, suggesting he look at the contents, which might be useful. The bartender pulled out a black turtleneck, and the brunette explained that he had bought it, having seen SeoWon's discomfort with the warm sweater at the university. The idea of wearing clothes bought by HeeYeon seemed like mockery to the protagonist and was met with aggression. He threw the shirt back, declaring that he would not accept such a gift, and reminded him whose fault it was that he had to search for high-necked clothing. In an attempt to change the subject, the bartender even asked the guest to order something, but was met with a refusal. The brunette grabbed SeoWon's hand and sharply drew closer, brushing his lips against the man's neck. To his pleas to stop, he simply stated that he wouldn't until he heard that the protagonist would wear the turtleneck. At home, the bartender stood before the mirror again, looking at the even denser redness than the day before. In addition to HeeYeon's marks, he had developed heat rash. He looked at the bag of gifted clothes by the coat rack, thinking he might have to wear that turtleneck after all. Upon arriving at the university, SeoWon tried to imagine his classmates' reaction when he saw him in the turtleneck. Images of the joyful brunette with a delighted expression on his face appeared in his mind. However, as the protagonist sat in the classroom and slightly calmed his thoughts, a girl ran in, panicked, and announced that HeeYeon hadn't arrived. The others were very surprised and wondered how they would present their report without the class president. Listening to their concerns about the brunette's absence, SeoWon was slightly relieved not to see him, but also somewhat worried about his absence. At HeeYeon's home, his parents were contemplating their son's condition and whether everything would be all right. The father mentioned that they had recently given the brunette a suppressant, so everything should be under control, and there should be no problems. However, the woman was not much comforted by this, and began to muse on how difficult it was to suppress heat, and even with strong medications, nothing was certain. But despite their concerns, the couple had to prepare for work, so they had to leave the young man alone. HeeYeon tossed and turned in bed, his thoughts incessantly returning to one alpha, and how wonderful it could be if the protagonist were beside him. He reached for the glass jar on his bedside table and swallowed a few more pills, hoping they would help. Meanwhile, at Munseong University, the professor concluded his lecture and dismissed the students. It announced an unexpected day off, and that he needn't go to work today, which greatly surprised the brunette. He even called his boss to clarify the situation, but nothing new was said. Nonetheless, this unexpected turn of events lifted his spirits immensely. The protagonist felt incredibly lucky that day. First, HeeYeon didn't come to class, sparing him the awkwardness of wearing the gifted clothing, and now he had a rare day off to finally relax. Approaching his apartment, the bartender was already making plans and thinking about having a drink, but he was unexpectedly yanked by the hood of his hoodie. When he turned around, he saw the brunette, who had already embraced him. But what was more remarkable was the class president's appearance. Though SeoWon Han was concerned about how he had found his address, the flushed face and labored breathing drew more attention. When HeeYeon asked about his own condition, the protagonist tried to respond as calmly as possible and merely inquired how his classmate had arrived there. It turned out that the boss had given the bartender's address, and upon learning this, he had new questions for his boss. SeoWon Han also tried to express his opinion that the class president should find another place to weather this condition. However, the brunette only said that the protagonist was the best option for him, which greatly angered the bartender. He began to argue that with such a partner, HeeYeon wouldn't find the satisfaction he sought. But the alpha stood his ground and merely stated his desire for intimacy. The scholarship student dropped his bag and tried to push the man away, but he was quite strong and simply expressed his wish to get inside the apartment quickly. To avoid drawing too much attention from the neighbors, SeoWon Han pressed a few buttons on the lock and opened the door, realizing the situation was critical. As soon as the door closed, HeeYeon completely let go of his self-control. He spoke of his desires and pressed himself tightly against the bartender. The protagonist blushed furiously at the man's actions and tried to restrain his own feelings, but not very successfully. The brunette savored this closeness and mentioned that he wouldn't calm down anytime soon, showing an entire pack of contraceptives. Clothes were already scattered on the floor, and SeoWon Han thought about how the pheromones effect was intensifying. The bartender pleaded for the man to stop, but he only gripped his hand tighter, not allowing him to pull away. SeoWon Han was utterly exhausted and managed to get to the shower, though he didn't expect the brunette to join him. He protested HeeYeon's actions, but he only awkwardly smiled and said he really couldn't control himself right now, and it was entirely his fault. Despite feeling much better than at the beginning, the man continued to justify his actions with the heat. When the protagonist finally dressed and lay on his bed, all his thoughts were focused on why he had the misfortune of attracting the department's most handsome man. Soon, the object of his thoughts also emerged from the shower, drying his face and asked about the bartender's well-being. Such a question only infuriated SeoWon Han, as he couldn't imagine anyone being all right after what he had just endured. The brunette responded by sitting on the bed, while the protagonist turned away and covered himself with a blanket. HeeYeon was puzzled by this behavior, and the bartender, still under the blanket, told him to go home. However, the buses had stopped running, and the brunette couldn't call a taxi as he had nothing with him besides his phone. He hadn't realized anything on the way to SeoWon Han's home, as a friend had given him a ride. Gathering his courage, the class president put on a pleading face and asked his classmate to let him stay the night. Understanding that he was left with no choice, the protagonist allowed the man to stay, but insisted he sleep on the floor. HeeYeon smiled broadly and said he was fine with that, as long as he got a blanket. SeoWon Han lived alone and didn't have an extra blanket, which he mentioned, to which the brunette enthusiastically lay on the bed and said that he would sleep beside him then. Despite not liking the idea of such close quarters, the bartender only asked not to be touched during the night and threatened consequences if the condition was not met. After HeeYeon assured him that he slept peacefully and there was nothing to worry about, the protagonist sighed and lay down, turning to face the wall. SeoWon Han dreamed of his school days when he lived with his parents in comfort and lacked nothing. His mother and father remained a loving couple even after many years, rarely arguing, and he was an exemplary child, the envy of others. Everything was perfect until a man entered their lives and quickly built a trusting relationship with the head of the family. They began to collaborate, and as the father expressed his favor, the man shared his plans. As a result, astonishing opportunities and power were supposed to unfold before the simple, middle-class entrepreneur. SeoWon's father believed the man's words and invested everything he had, only to find himself left with nothing. He had to kneel and beg, but then the man revealed his true nature, and the head of the family finally learned of the deception. The happy family shattered into pieces in an instant, and in just one day, they had to move from their nice home to a very shabby one. Shortly after, lenders started coming with demands for repayment, and the situation seemed hopeless. SeoWon Han was left alone with his father's insurmountable debts, and, taught by his father's bitter experience, stopped trusting people who showed him kindness. When the protagonist woke up, his thoughts immediately went to how much his head ached and his body ached, and the memories of the previous day began to return. He collapsed onto the bed with a sense of resignation, and at the sound, HeeYeon entered the room, expressing concern for his condition. The brunette apologized for pushing the bartender to this state, explaining that as soon as he saw he was ill, he left his classes and would stay until SeoWon Han felt better. It turned out it was already 2 in the afternoon, and the class president had also informed the bar owner about the protagonist's illness, so he wouldn't be coming to work. Thoughts swirled in his head, only half listening to HeeYeon, who was explaining that he couldn't find any cold medicine and couldn't leave for the pharmacy because he didn't know the door code to return. The man asked for the code to go to the store, but SeoWon Han had no desire to provide such information. At that moment, the brunette received a message from a classmate who had made notes from the lecture. Realizing he wouldn't get the code so easily, the class president offered to share the lecture notes in exchange for the information. In the protagonist's mind, a balance scale appeared with reasons to refuse on one side and the benefits he would gain on the other. Clenching his fists, SeoWon Han reluctantly gave the required combination to the victorious brunette, who was already making a shopping list. After HeeYeon left, closing the door behind him, the bartender lay back down on the bed, intending to nap some more. When SeoWon Han awoke, he saw the brunette beside him, dressed in his clothes and holding a bowl of rice porridge. The man was already extending a spoonful of porridge to the protagonist, intending to feed him, but encountered resistance. The bartender wanted to refuse such feeding and eat on his own, but his words went unheard. Instead, HeeYeon tried to shove food into the sick man's mouth between protests. SeoWon Han grimaced, and the brunette immediately moved closer, embracing him and inquiring about his well-being. Reassuring him that everything would pass, the class president noted that he had been sleeping even when he returned from the store and should eat to recover faster. Weighing the pros and cons in his mind, the protagonist submissively opened his mouth, allowing the triumphant HeeYeon to feed him. Once the bartender had eaten and lay back down, he again faced his classmate's concern, asking how he could help. Such care felt intrusive, and although he didn't need anything at the moment, he still asked for a damp towel. As SeoWon Han wiped his face of sweat, he noticed the room was cleaner, surprised that the brunette had tidied up the apartment. The class president was pleased to have been helpful and said he would cook something delicious after classes the next day. The protagonist expressed surprise at HeeYeon's culinary skills, and the latter assured him, showing his phone screen, that he was indeed good at cooking. After taking the dirty towel, the man lay down next to him on the bed again, inquiring once more about the bartender's well-being. Without any protest, SeoWon Han closed his eyes and smiled, thinking that the brunette was very concerned, but it felt warm and comfortable now. HeeYeon noticed the protagonist's face relaxing as he drifted into a deep sleep, embraced him, and closed his eyes. Upon waking, SeoWon Han immediately saw the class president's face and realized he had indeed decided to stay until he was fully recovered. Unexpectedly, the brunette opened his eyes, causing the protagonist to startle, and asked why he was staring at him so intently. Flustered and unable to answer the tricky question, the man instead asked when the class president had woken up. It turned out he had been awake when the bartender started watching him, and hearing this, the latter felt a twinge of embarrassment. Then HeeYeon stood up, touched the protagonist's cheek with his lips, and asked if they didn't resemble newlyweds. To the protagonist, such a question seemed absurd, but the brunette smiled contentedly and began talking about how they slept, woke up, and ate together. However, SeoWon Han didn't think this warranted a comparison to newlyweds, as it all happened because of the brunette's lack of self-control the previous day. The class president noted that the bartender was already getting better and expressed regret that such time spent together would now end. Seizing the moment, the protagonist even suggested that he leave now, but the brunette remarked that he would still have plenty of opportunities to meet. The scholarship student grimaced at the failed attempt to get rid of the uninvited guest, but the latter only found it amusing and suggested they have a snack. SeoWon Han's assurances that he didn't need it, as he wasn't used to eating breakfast, had no effect, and the brunette began talking about how skipping meals could negatively affect his health. The protagonist was annoyed that HeeYeon was forcing him to eat the food he had prepared, but the latter simply replied that he was very worried and doing everything for a speedy recovery. It was time for them to head to their classes, but just before leaving, the brunette suggested they go in his car. SeoWon Han was categorically opposed to this idea, as if other students saw them together, it could spawn countless rumors. Moreover, there was no chance that the department's most handsome man's car would go unnoticed. It stood out too much. Every argument hit an impenetrable wall, as HeeYeon talked about the protagonist's poor condition and how he was still hunched over from back pain while walking. The brunette then smirked, closed the front door, and effortlessly picked up the bewildered man heading for his car. In SeoWon Han's mind, images began to appear of other students whispering and discussing the relationship between the two alphas, given their joint commute to school. The bartender's apartment was close to the university, so he didn't think about buckling up. But when he and Anne said he would help him fasten his seatbelt if he didn't, the man decisively pulled the buckle towards the lock. Upon arriving, SeoWon Han saw a crowd of people who couldn't ignore the arrival of the department's most handsome man. He felt awkward getting out of the car due to the excessive attention, but noticing the protagonist's hesitation, the brunette remarked that a kiss would escalate the rumors even more. This remark made the bartender bolt out of the car, while the owner remained seated with a slight smirk. At that moment, one of the class president's friends saw SeoWon Han walking away from the car and wondered why someone like HeeYeon would come to university with such a loser. On the way home, once again sitting in the passenger seat of HeeYeon's car, the protagonist wondered how long he planned to stay in his apartment. But the man jokingly replied that he hadn't decided yet, and any attempts by SeoWon Han to protest were interrupted by a light kiss. The next day, during the lecture, the brunette kept glancing at the bartender, pondering his behavior and appearance. But whenever their eyes met, he sent a sweet smile. When the lecture concluded and the professor announced a test in 2 weeks, HeeYeon could only think about how quickly he could get home with the protagonist. However, a friend who wanted to talk to him distracted him, so the brunette sent a message asking the scholarship student to wait for him in the parking lot. SeoWon Han headed to the car, but overheard a conversation between a classmate and the class president and decided to linger a bit. The gray-haired classmate was discussing interactions with the protagonist, questioning why he and Anne had gotten close to him despite all the rumors. It turned out that at the beginning of the semester, SeoWon Han had come with a mark on his neck, leading many to conclude that he was selling his body, even though he was an alpha. The man, for whom this was news, recalled a situation when a client had left a mark in an inconvenient place. Nonetheless, the classmate continued to wonder why HeeYeon, knowing these rumors, continued to associate with him, as it could spark gossip about the class president himself. When asked to tell the truth, the brunette thought confessing everything wasn't easy, but his friend was persistent and wouldn't relent without some explanation. Sighing demonstratively and mentally apologizing to SeoWon Han, he said he was forced to associate with the scholarship student due to threats. The gray-haired classmate was incredibly surprised by this statement, as was the bartender who was standing around the corner. Meanwhile, the brunette continued to answer, revealing that one day the classmate had approached him and threatened to tell everyone about his promiscuous sexual activities unless he started associating with him. His friend was furious at this story, and HeeYeon said that if he had his way, he wouldn't pretend to be friendly towards the guy. He also asked the gray-haired classmate to keep everything secret to avoid spreading rumors, and the latter, expressing understanding, promised not to tell anyone. Meanwhile, SeoWon Han stood clenching his fists, thinking that the person he had begun to trust had stabbed him in the back, playing a vile act behind his back. Having once again lost faith in people, the protagonist decided he would never forgive him for this. HeeYeon sat at home, unable to understand what had happened and why the protagonist had told him to take back the few things he had brought to his apartment. Now he held his phone with a notification about a refund. He had no idea what had transpired. Upon arriving at the university, the man scanned the classroom, but SeoWon Han had not yet arrived. A classmate approached him, asking whom he was looking for and if she could help. But the class president just waved her off, saying it was nothing serious. He had barely sat down when SeoWon Han entered the room, and the brunette jumped up, calling out the scholarship student's name. The class president grabbed his forearm and led him away, leaving everyone bewildered by the unusual scene. After walking a short distance, the protagonist pulled his arm out of the grip and demanded to know what the brunette was doing. HeeYeon expressed his confusion about why the bartender had stopped responding to messages and even refunded the money. SeoWon Han explained that he didn't want anything to bind them, so he had acted accordingly, especially since the class president had said he wanted to end their interaction as soon as possible. In an instant, the brunette recalled the recent conversation with his friend and couldn't believe the protagonist had heard everything. He tried to explain that everything he said then was a lie, as he didn't want SeoWon Han to face trouble because of it. But the protagonist no longer believed him, recalling the contempt with which the class president had spoken about him. He admitted that he had briefly believed HeeYeon could be a good person but had been betrayed. The bartender was about to leave and simply said that he would no longer interact with him, as the brunette had wanted. That evening in the bar, SeoWon Han sat with a regular client he hadn't seen in a while, graciously accepting the embraces of the fairly drunk and flushed patron. Then, when he saw HeeYeon at the entrance, he placed his hands on the client's waist and kissed him. The brunette, upon witnessing this scene, simply frowned and headed for the exit, unable to watch any longer. Afterwards, the bartender had to step aside with his boss, who expressed surprise at the changed behavior, noting that the employee had previously been in a different mood and speculated that something had happened. SeoWon Han didn't provide a detailed answer, and only asked if HeeYeon An had been told he would no longer be served. Due to the threat of losing his most popular employee, the manager had to refuse new meetings, and upon hearing confirmation that he was no longer obliged to serve a specific client, the man returned to work. As the protagonist was leaving the bar, he encountered the brunette, who didn't want their relationship to end this way. However, SeoWon Han didn't need explanations. In response to a confession of feelings, he merely replied that words were simple and didn't guarantee there wouldn't be another betrayal. The bartender pushed the other's hand away and, saying there was nothing more to discuss, headed home. Another lecture was in progress, and SeoWon Han was diligently taking notes, as was the brunette, who continued to cast regretful glances at the bartender. It was the end of the semester, and as classes ended, many students noisily discussed their holiday plans with their classmates. Predictably, the protagonist left the room quietly, while the class president watched him go, thinking that it would be a long time before he saw him again. Upon arriving home, HeeYeon An was met with unexpected news about a planned introduction arranged by his mother. She was displeased with her son's reaction, while he, in turn, couldn't understand what kind of reaction she expected, especially since she hadn't warned him about her plans. The woman asked the brunette to at least meet the person and then make decisions, insisting she wasn't trying to force anything upon her only child. Sighing heavily, HeeYeon agreed to meet the person his mother wanted to set him up with. Sitting in a cafe, the young man watched the women's animated conversation, then glanced at the handsome, fair-haired young man they wanted to introduce to him. He introduced himself as Dog Young Bae and extended his hand in greeting, but as the alpha reached out to shake it, he noticed something unusual. Meanwhile, SeoWon Han was at the bar, serving a blonde woman and maintaining a measured conversation. The woman noted she had seen the bartender working frequently lately, and he explained that since the semester had ended, he decided to work on weekends as well. It also came to light that the brunette would no longer be receiving his scholarship in the final semester, having failed his exams. The next question about the reasons for his failure made the man recall HeeYeon An, whose interaction had undoubtedly affected his academic performance. Nevertheless, after a few moments, the protagonist regained his composure and, attempting to distract the patron, poured her a drink. Feeling embarrassed for allowing himself to get distracted, he apologized, but the blonde understood, saying she too sometimes got lost in thought. The woman then said she wanted to spend the night with the bartender, and when he tried to decline, she sat on his lap. SeoWon Han was lost in thoughts about how often patrons made such proposals, but he was distracted by the client's voice. She remarked that he had a dark spot on his neck that looked like paint, but wiping it didn't help. Apologizing for the inconvenience, the bartender excused himself to check in the mirror what the spot was. However, what he saw shocked him. Inscribed on his skin, as if in black ink, was the name HeeYeon An. After the holidays, as SeoWon Han walked to the university, his left neck was entirely covered by a white bandage. Inwardly, he cursed HeeYeon An, who, by some strange twist of fate, turned out to be his true mate. He remembered visiting doctors to have the inscription removed, but they said they could only see a large mark and couldn't help due to the name's significance. Unintentionally, the protagonist thought about how the lack of friends at the university was fortunate, as it avoided unnecessary questions. However, as soon as other students saw the bandage, it sparked a new wave of rumors, claiming that SeoWon Han had gotten into a fight during the break, while others suggested he had been selling his body again. The bartender, who heard all these comments, was appalled by the open whispers behind his back. Such behavior infuriated him. When he sat down, he saw HeeYeon arrive. He greeted everyone cheerfully and started discussing the news. Then one of the girls noticed the new watch the class president wore and commented on it, and he replied it was a gift. Not too tactfully, his classmates asked if this meant he had been on a date and if it was a gift from a partner. The brunette didn't dispute the assumption, simply nodding while keenly observing SeoWon Han's reaction. To his disappointment, the bartender showed no interest. However, the other students asked too many questions about the gift giver's appearance and personality, even suggesting it could be his true mate. HeeYeon An didn't deny this theory, causing a new wave of excitement among the students and sighs from some of them. A classmate explained that many present had wanted to win the affection of the department's most handsome man, so it was no surprise they were now disappointed. SeoWon Han sat with his head resting on his hand, thinking how fortunate the brunette was to have met his true mate, and decided to push these thoughts aside, as they didn't concern him. But the next moment he remembered the name on his neck and felt confused. Should he get involved in this matter? After classes, HeeYeon answered a call and told the caller he would be out soon, while a few classmates had already started discussing it. The protagonist, glancing at the departing man, tried to convince himself it wasn't his business.